She pressed her manicured finger toward him like he was something stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "Could you please have that man moved? He's making my table look bad." The cafe went quiet. 50 people stared at the man in the worn jacket, a tired-looking single father nursing the cheapest coffee on the menu. Nobody laughed out loud. But they didn't have to. 60 minutes later, that same man would be standing over 3 unconscious armed gunmen. And every person in that room would be alive because of him. If you've never subscribed to this channel, now is the moment. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay with me until the very last word. Because this story will remind you that the most dangerous people in any room are usually the quietest ones. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The city didn't slow down for anyone on a Tuesday morning. That was something Ethan Cross had accepted a long time ago. Cities didn't care about your story. They didn't care about the 3 tours you completed overseas, or the commendations sitting in a shoebox under your bed, or the way your hands still sometimes shook at 3 a.m. for reasons you'd stopped trying to explain to people. Cities moved. People moved. And if you stopped moving with them, they simply walked around you and kept going. Ethan had learned to be okay with that. He pushed through the glass door of Meridian Coffee at 7:42, the little bell above the entrance making a sound that was almost apologetic for interrupting the noise inside. The place was full. Floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed brick walls the color of burnt caramel, Edison bulbs hanging at different lengths over wooden tables that probably cost more per square foot than the furniture in his apartment. It was the kind of place that put artisan in front of words that didn't need it. Artisan water. Artisan toast. He'd seen the menu once and quietly put it back down. But the location was right. It was 7 blocks from his son Marcus's school, 4 blocks from the recreation center where the under-12 soccer league held morning practices, and it had chairs you could actually sit in without your back complaining. Those were the only 3 criteria that mattered. He got in line behind a woman in a camel coat who was ordering something with 5 specifications. Oat milk, no foam, 2 pumps, not 3. Extra hot, but not too extra hot. Ethan watched the young barista behind the counter, a kid, maybe 22, with tired eyes and good posture, write everything down without flinching. Working the morning rush with that kind of patience deserved more than whatever they were paying him. When it was Ethan's turn, he kept it simple. Small dark roast, no room. The kid, his name tag said Danny, glanced up from the register. "You sure? We've got a Colombian single origin that just came in. It's really good." "How much more?" $1.50. Ethan considered it for exactly 1 second. He had a specific budget for the morning and a specific amount left in his wallet until Friday's direct deposit cleared. The math wasn't complicated. "Dark roast is fine. Thanks, Danny." He paid in cash, exact change, and moved to the end of the counter to wait. The field jacket he wore was military green, the kind they stopped making in that exact cut sometime around 2003. The collar was frayed at one edge where the stitching had finally given up. He'd had it restitched twice by a tailor on Callaway Street who charged $20 a repair and never asked questions, but the collar had been beyond saving the last time. The backpack over his right shoulder was dark canvas, one of the buckle clasps replaced with a mismatched clip from a hiking supply store. It held his son's extra shin guards, a water bottle, a worn paperback he'd been reading for 3 weeks because he kept falling asleep before the second chapter, and a manila folder with Marcus's updated school forms that needed signatures he hadn't found time to sit down with yet. He looked, if he was being honest, like a man who'd fallen a little behind. Not homeless, not dangerous, just behind. Like the city had been moving at 60 miles an hour, and somewhere in the last few years, he'd dropped to 45 and hadn't quite caught back up. He found a table near the far wall, second from the window, partly out of habit, and partly because from that angle he could see both the front entrance and the side corridor that led to the restrooms and the emergency exit. He set his backpack on the chair beside him, not on the floor, a habit so old he couldn't remember forming it. And when Danny slid the dark roast across the counter, Ethan picked it up and wrapped both hands around the paper cup. His knuckles were scarred. Not dramatically. Not the kind of scars that made strangers ask questions. Just the accumulated evidence of a life that had been physical, that had asked things of his hands that hands weren't strictly designed to do, and that had left small permanent answers in the tissue. He didn't read the paperback. He drank the coffee slowly and watched the room with the kind of attention that most people reserve for things that interest them, but which Ethan applied to everything as a matter of reflex. Two men in corner seats running a pitch meeting, one of them clicking a pen every 12 seconds. A woman by the window alternating between her laptop and her phone with the specific frustration of someone whose morning had already gone sideways. Four people in a cluster near the bar, mid-40s, all wearing the same style of lanyard, probably a conference group from the hotel 2 blocks east. A pair of older women sharing a pastry and talking in low, comfortable voices, the kind of conversation that meant they'd known each other for decades. Normal Tuesday morning, safe room. He relaxed slightly. Not completely. He hadn't relaxed completely anywhere since about 2009, but enough to let his shoulders drop half an inch and let the coffee do what coffee was supposed to do. That was when Isabella Sterling walked in. She didn't enter a room so much as she rearranged it. It wasn't the looks, though she had those. It wasn't the clothing, though the black blazer she wore probably cost more than Ethan's car. It was something structural, the way she moved through space like she'd already done the calculation and confirmed that the room existed primarily as a setting for her arrival. The three people behind her adjusted their pace to match hers without being asked. The hostess straightened. Even the ambient noise seemed to consider briefly whether it was appropriate. 30 years old. Forbes had put her on the cover 6 months ago under the headline, "She built it faster than you thought possible." Ethan had seen it at the dentist's office while waiting for Marcus's cleaning and had read the first 2 paragraphs before a hygienist called them back. He didn't recognize her now. He simply noted her the way he noted everyone, assessed, cataloged, moved on. She was seated at the large corner table with the best sightlines and the most visible position in the room, which suggested to him either that she'd requested it specifically or that the staff had anticipated her preference. 5 people arranged themselves around her. 3 men in dark suits with the specific posture of people who were being paid to seem indispensable. A woman with a tablet who was typing before she'd fully sat down. A younger man who appeared to be taking notes on actual paper, which in this room seemed almost eccentric. The meeting started immediately. No preamble, no coffee orders first, no asking how everyone's morning had been. She opened with numbers. Ethan could hear the cadence of it from across the room, even without making out the words. Quick, clipped, efficient. The kind of communication that had been trained out of every excess. He returned to his coffee. He had 40 minutes before he needed to walk the 6 blocks to the recreation center. Marcus's practice ended at 9:15, and the coach had mentioned last week that there was a conversation they needed to have about Marcus's tendency to hang back on the left side of the formation rather than pressing forward. The coach had meant it as a critique. Ethan had mentally filed it as a different thing entirely. His son protecting his weaker angle, same as his father. Instinct, maybe. Or something inherited that Ethan didn't know quite how to unteach. He was thinking about that when he heard the voice. Not the words at first, just the tone. Sharp, carrying. The kind of voice that wasn't concerned about whether anyone else was inconvenienced by it. I don't understand why we're expected to conduct serious business in an environment like this. He didn't look up. The ambiance is inconsistent. The table layout is awkward. And whoever designed the seating arrangements clearly didn't consider a pause. The full demographic of the clientele. That word, clientele. Set in a specific direction. Ethan picked up his coffee cup and looked at it. He heard one of the suited men say something low and quick. He heard Isabella respond with something that contained the phrase, "Not my problem to manage." He heard the woman with the tablet stop typing briefly, then start again. Then he heard Danny's voice, and the tone of it was different from the one the kid had used at the counter. Flatter. Carefully neutral. "Ma'am, I understand. Is there something I can help with?" "Yes, there is something you can help with. Clear as a bell. Conversational in the way that people are conversational when they want you to understand they are not asking. There's a gentleman sitting at the table by the wall who appears to be," she seemed to consider the right word, "camping. He's been there since before we arrived, and frankly the look of him is at odds with the environment we're trying to create here. Could you find him somewhere more appropriate to sit, preferably not in my sightline?" The room, which had been doing its polite work of pretending not to listen, quietly stopped pretending. Ethan set down his cup. He didn't look over. He kept his eyes on the table in front of him and breathed the way he'd been taught to breathe when things required stillness. Slow, from the belly, nothing in the face. He felt the familiar thing happen behind his sternum, the thing that had no good name but which he'd learned to neither feed nor fight. Just let it exist. Just keep breathing around it. Danny said carefully, "Sir, I apologize. Would you like to—" "He's fine where he is." A different voice, one of the older women who'd been sharing a pastry. She hadn't raised her voice, but it landed clearly. "He was here before any of us." "This isn't a community discussion," Isabella said, and now there was something else in her tone. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. The kind of amusement that people display when they're used to winning. "It's a simple request to a member of staff. And I'm a customer offering an opinion." Brief silence. Ethan finally looked up. Isabella Sterling was watching him with the expression of someone evaluating a piece of furniture that had been left in the wrong room. Not hostile, exactly. More like puzzled. Like she genuinely couldn't account for how he'd gotten there. Their eyes met. He held it for a moment. Not as a challenge. Not as anything. He just looked back at her, the way he'd looked at a lot of things over the years, with a kind of patience that didn't require a response. Then he looked at Danny. "Don't worry about it," he said. His voice was quiet. "If it's easier, I can take the table in the back. It's not a problem." Danny looked like he wanted to say something that his job wouldn't allow him to say. "You don't have to do that, sir. You were here first." "I know." Ethan reached for his backpack. "But there's a table in the back that's fine, honestly." "He doesn't have to move." The older woman again, her name, Ethan would later learn, was Frances. And she had the specific stubbornness of a woman who had been arguing with people who thought they were important for several decades. "She doesn't own this table. She doesn't own this cafe." "Frances." Her companion touched her arm. "I'm serious, Miriam. This is ridiculous." Isabella turned to look at Frances with the measured expression of someone deciding whether the inconvenience was worth the engagement. She apparently decided it wasn't. "Fine," she said, and redirected her attention to the tablet woman. "Pull up the Whitmore projections. We're wasting time." She opened her phone. Took a photograph. Not of the room. Of Ethan. Or rather, in Ethan's direction. One of those photos that people take to send to someone with a caption that's meant to be cutting. He saw the motion in his peripheral vision and registered it the way he registered most things. Filed, cataloged, set aside for later. He didn't move to the back table. He stayed where he was, finished his coffee, and said nothing. Frances caught his eye from across the room and gave him a look that communicated across the distance. Something like, "I've met her type before and I'm sorry." He gave a small nod. He appreciated it. The meeting at Isabella's table continued. The numbers flew, the tablet scrolled, the suited men nodded at intervals. She was clearly intelligent. He could tell that even from across a room, even not understanding half the vocabulary. Quick, decisive. The kind of person who'd trained herself to cut away anything that wasn't useful. He could recognize that training even if the context was entirely different from his own. He found himself wondering in an idle way that surprised him slightly what had happened to her. Not in a judgment, more in the way you look at a piece of machinery that's been modified and wonder what the original design had been. Then he stopped wondering about Isabella Sterling entirely because three men walked through the front door of Meridian Coffee, and the moment they crossed the threshold, every nerve in Ethan Cross's body went from idle to something else entirely. He didn't move. That was the first thing. The instinct, years of it, carved into muscle and reflex in the space between heartbeats, said, "Stay still." Moving would change what you were. Right now, he was background. Background was safe. Background let you see. The three men spread out as they entered. Not in a rush. Not in a way that would register as unusual to anyone who wasn't trained to read it. They looked like they were simply choosing tables, simply navigating a crowded morning cafe. But Ethan had spent more hours of his life than he could count learning the difference between how people move when they're choosing and how they move when they're already decided. These men had already decided. First man, near the door. Positioned left of the entrance. His jacket hung wrong on his left side. Not a tailoring issue. Weight distribution. Something under the arm. His eyes went to the corners of the room first, not to the menu board. People who don't know what they want look at the menu. People who are checking for cameras look at corners. Second man, moving toward the counter, but slowly, and with his right hand inside the front pocket of his hoodie in the specific way that meant the pocket wasn't carrying keys or a phone. His body was angled slightly toward the barista station. Pre-positioning. Third man, already near the back hallway, near the emergency exit. He was the one Ethan looked at last and looked at longest, because this one was the most important. The one near the exit was either the escape route or the one they'd leave at the back to cut off that option for everyone else. Ethan read the posture, the way the man's weight was slightly forward, slightly ready, and understood, cutting off the exit. This was going to happen in less than 2 minutes. Ethan lowered his coffee cup slowly. He rolled his right shoulder once, just once, the way you'd roll it if it was stiff. He shifted in his chair very slightly, adjusting his angle to the room. His left foot moved 2 inches to the left under the table, finding the floor. He looked at Danny behind the counter. Danny was watching the second man approach, not yet alarmed, still in the professional mode of someone preparing to take an order. The woman on the laptop had headphones in and her back to the door. The conference group was laughing about something. Francis and Miriam were still talking, though the energy at their table had shifted slightly since the exchange earlier. Isabella's table was fully absorbed. The Whitmore projections, or whatever they were, had everyone's eyes on the tablet. Nobody else saw it. Ethan looked at the first man by the door and met his eyes for a fraction of a second. Not long enough to create anything, just long enough to confirm what he already knew. The man's gaze was flat, professional, not nervous. This isn't their first time. He thought briefly of Marcus, not as distraction. He'd learned long ago to think of Marcus quickly and then put Marcus somewhere safe in the back of his mind, somewhere the situation couldn't reach him. He thought of his son's face at the last game, the way Marcus had laughed when he'd missed an easy shot, and then immediately reset, shoulders back, already thinking about the next play. 12 years old and already doing the thing that took some people their whole lives to learn. I'll be there at 9:15, Ethan thought, same as always. Then he put Marcus away, safe and untouchable, and gave everything else his complete attention. The second man reached the counter. Danny looked up with the professional smile. "Welcome to Meridian. What can I get?" The man's hand came out of his pocket. What happened in the next 4 seconds would take investigators 3 hours to reconstruct from the security footage. What the footage showed, and what would eventually be seen by several million people on various news platforms, though Ethan wouldn't know this for some time, was a man in a worn field jacket rising from a chair with a quality of movement that seemed somehow incompatible with the person who'd been sitting there. Not fast in the way people imagine speed, not the Hollywood version, all visible effort and dramatic noise. Just efficient, compressed, like watching a piece of machinery perform the function it was designed for, with nothing wasted and nothing added. But that was later. That was the footage. What happened in the actual seconds was something that Ethan experienced differently, the way he always had, as a strange slowing down that wasn't really slow at all, time thickening like the moments before weather changed, details sharpening until he could see the tremor in Danny's lower lip, and the exact angle at which the first gunman's weight shifted toward the room. The second man's weapon cleared the counter height, and Ethan was already moving. He'd covered the distance to the counter before the sound of the first shout had fully registered in anyone else's auditory system. He moved through the cafe the way water moves, not around obstacles so much as between them, finding the line that existed before anyone else knew there was a line. His backpack hit the floor somewhere. He didn't register dropping it. The second man turned. And then he didn't. The first incapacitation took less than a second and a half. The weapon hit the floor. Ethan had already turned. The man near the door was raising his weapon when Ethan's elbow found his forearm in a motion that was almost gentle in its precision. The specific application of force to the specific joint at the specific angle that removed the option. The gun went one way. The man went another. Neither of them made much noise. The third man, the one by the exit, the most dangerous variable because he was furthest away and had the most time to react, was already moving when Ethan reached him. This one was more complicated. This one required 2 additional seconds and a chair from table 7 and a very particular grip on a wrist that the forensic examiner would later describe in a report as consistent with advanced close-quarters combat training. Then it was quiet. The whole cafe was on the floor. The whole cafe was staying very, very still. except Ethan, who was standing in the center of the room with his breathing only slightly elevated, looking at the three men who were no longer a threat and would not be one for the foreseeable future. He became aware, gradually, that someone was crying, then more than one person. Then the muffled sound of Danny from behind the counter saying, "Okay, okay, okay." In the way people say things when they're talking to themselves because their brain needs to hear a human voice. Ethan turned around. Isabella Sterling was on the floor behind her table. Her blazer had a coffee stain across the lapel from where someone's cup had gone over in the initial scramble. Her hair, which had been arranged with the precision of someone's professional attention, was entirely undone. She was shaking. The woman with the tablet was pressed against the wall beside her. One of the suited men had both hands over his head and hadn't moved them. Ethan looked at Isabella. She looked back at him from the floor. Her face was an expression he'd never quite seen on a person before. Not fear exactly, because fear was something he knew how to read. This was something that happened after fear, something that fear had scraped clean and left exposed underneath. She opened her mouth, closed it again. He turned away and walked to the counter, stepping over a toppled chair, and put his hand on the counter where Danny was still crouched. "Hey," he said quietly. "You okay?" Danny looked up at him with the enormous eyes of someone who was going to be shaking for a week. Yeah, I think—" He stopped. "Who are you?" Ethan looked toward the front windows where, already, blue and red light was beginning to pulse against the glass. "Nobody important," he said. "Call your manager. Tell them what happened. And get some water for the people on the floor." Then he went and found his backpack, sat down at his original table, and waited for the police. Outside, Marcus Cross was probably just lacing up his cleats, probably trying to remember which shin guard went on which leg, which was a thing he'd gotten wrong the last 3 practices, and which Ethan had gently corrected each time without making it into anything bigger than it was. The coffee in his cup was cold now. He drank it anyway. Some things you finished because you'd started them. That had always seemed like a reason good enough. The first police cruiser arrived at 7:59, which Ethan knew because he'd looked at his watch when the light started pulsing against the windows, and done the small arithmetic of how much time he had left before he needed to be at the recreation center. 54 minutes. Enough time if this moved quickly. It rarely moved quickly. It didn't move quickly. The first 2 officers through the door were young, early 30s at most, hands on holsters, eyes doing the fast scan of a room they'd been told contained an active threat. They found 3 men zip-tied with their own shoelaces and a cafe full of people either sitting on the floor or pressed against walls, and it took them approximately 4 seconds of visual assessment to locate the person who'd done it. Ethan had his hands visible on the table, palms up, fingers spread. He'd been in this position before, from the other side of it, and he understood the language. "Sir, don't move." "Not moving," he said. "I'm the one who called it in." The younger of the 2 officers, a woman with dark hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt, came toward him while her partner went to the 3 men on the floor. She kept her hand near her holster but didn't draw. That was good. That was professional. "You made the call?" "From my cell, about 4 minutes ago." He'd used the brief window after the 3 men stopped being a problem, and before the adrenaline in the room converted itself into chaos. He'd kept his voice level on the phone. He'd given them what they needed: location, number of subjects, weapon status, civilian count, in the order that would get help moving fastest. Then he'd hung up, gone back to his table, and waited. "And you?" She looked at the 3 men, then back at him. "You did that?" "Yes." She stared at him for a moment in the way people stare at things that don't match the category they've been assigned to. A man in a worn field jacket, a backpack with a mismatched buckle. The cheapest coffee on the menu, now cold. "I'm going to need you to stay seated until my supervisor arrives." "That's fine," he said. "I've got about 45 minutes before I need to be somewhere. If we can move through the paperwork reasonably, that would help." She blinked. "You have somewhere to be." "My son has soccer practice." She looked at him for another long moment, then pressed her radio. Bob. The supervisor who arrived 11 minutes later was a detective named Carla Reyes, and the moment she walked through the door and saw the scene, the 3 men, the positioning, the fact that not a single civilian had so much as a broken fingernail. She went through a very quick series of expressions before her face settled into something carefully professional that Ethan recognized as the look of someone who had just upgraded their assessment of a situation considerably. She spoke briefly to the first officers, looked at the security camera mounted above the counter, and then came directly to Ethan's table. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without asking. He respected that. "Ethan Cross," she said, reading from the ID one of the first officers had collected. Then she stopped. Read it again. Looked up at him. He waited. "This is a military ID," she said. "Retired," he said. 3 years. "Navy." "Yes." She set the ID down on the table between them and looked at him with the specific attention of someone recalibrating. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to understand it's not an accusation. It's because I'm trying to fill in a very large blank. Ask it. How does a retired Navy man take down 3 armed individuals in a room full of civilians without, and I'm looking at this room very carefully, without anyone getting hurt? Not the hostages. Not even the subjects." He thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being a thing he'd have to spend the next hour explaining. "Training," he said finally, "and positioning. I was already in a good seat." Reyes looked at the table he'd chosen. The angle of it. The sight lines. She was smart enough to understand what she was looking at. "What was your rate?" she asked. The Navy term for rank specialty. She knew enough to use it, he told her. She absorbed that for a moment. "How long?" 22 years active, last 8 running direct action and personnel recovery. There was a particular kind of silence that descended after you said the words personnel recovery to someone with a law enforcement background. It was the silence of a person resorting everything they thought they understood about the last 15 minutes. "Okay," she said. Then, after another pause, "Okay." She picked up the ID and stood. "I'm going to need a formal statement, but I also need to confirm some things first. Don't go anywhere." 40 minutes, he reminded her. She almost smiled. Almost. "I'll see what I can do." The cafe had fractured into separate pools of reaction, the way rooms always did after something terrible had almost happened. Near the front window, the conference group was clustered together, most of them on phones, one of the men pacing a tight oval with his hands on his head. The woman who'd been on her laptop had finally removed her headphones and was sitting very still with her hands in her lap, staring at the middle distance with the particular blankness of someone whose mind was processing things on a delay. Danny had come out from behind the counter and was sitting on the floor with his back against it, and Frances had crossed the room without anyone asking her to and was sitting beside him, saying something quiet that Ethan couldn't hear. He was glad Frances had done that. He hadn't known how to do that part. Isabella Sterling had not moved from the floor behind her table for several minutes after the police arrived, which was understandable, and then had been helped to a chair by one of her suited men, the one who hadn't spent the entire incident with both hands over his head. She had a paper cup of water that someone had brought her. She was holding it the way people hold things when they need their hands to be doing something or they're not sure what the rest of them will do. The woman with the tablet, whose name, Ethan would overhear later, was Priya, was sitting beside her and had put a hand on Isabella's arm. Isabella hadn't moved the arm away, which seemed like it might be significant, though Ethan wasn't in a position to know. He found himself watching her for a few seconds, not with anything that could be called satisfaction, more with the vague, complicated feeling he always had in the aftermath, the part where the room was safe and the threat was neutralized and his own body was starting to walk back from wherever it had been. And in that walk back there was always this brief window where he could see everything very clearly and feel almost nothing about it, which was both useful and, if he thought about it too long, slightly troubling. Isabella caught him looking. She turned away first. It took another 6 minutes before things escalated in a direction Ethan hadn't anticipated. A second vehicle had arrived outside. Not a cruiser this time, but a dark SUV, unmarked, the kind with government plates that didn't advertise which government agency had issued them. 2 men in suits that were cut differently from the ones in the cafe stepped out. Federal. The way they moved through the door confirmed it before they'd shown credentials to anyone. Reyes met them near the entrance. There was a brief exchange that Ethan couldn't hear but could read well enough from body language. The federal agents glanced in his direction. Reyes said something that seemed to involve the word aware. One of the agents nodded slowly, in the way people nod when they've just been confirmed in a suspicion they'd already been carrying. The agent who came to Ethan's table was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had been outdoor weathered and then desk weathered in roughly equal measure over a long career, gray at the temples. The suit fit well. He didn't offer a hand. Mr. Cross? That's me? Agent Mercer. I'm not going to waste your time with a long explanation of who I am. Appreciate that. We've had a flag on the Meridian block for the last 72 hours. These three, he glanced toward where the subjects were now being formally processed, are part of a crew we've been watching for a while. 3 commercial robberies in the last 4 months, escalating. We had intel suggesting this location, this week. We just didn't have it narrow enough. You were close. We were 40 minutes out. Mercer said it flatly, without apology, but also without the defensiveness that a lesser agent might have brought to that admission, which is relevant because what happened in the window between when we weren't here and when we were... He paused. The footage is going to be very clear about who was here instead. Ethan looked at him steadily. Is that a problem? It's not a problem for us. For the people whose phones are already uploading that footage to the internet, Mercer's expression didn't change. That's going to be somebody else's problem to manage. Ethan thought about that for a moment. The security camera above the counter, the phones that had come out once the situation was resolved, people, even terrified people, reaching reflexively for documentation. He'd noticed it in the aftermath. He'd filed it. He hadn't thought enough about what it meant. I'd rather it not. I understand that, Mercer said, but I'm not going to insult you by pretending we can walk that back. It's already out there. A pause. We can do some things. We can be thoughtful about how the official record characterizes your background, but the footage exists and people have seen it. Ethan rubbed the edge of his thumb along the rim of the coffee cup. The cold coffee. The small, ordinary object from before any of this. My son is 12, he said. I know. Mercer said it simply, not as a display of having done research, but as the acknowledgement of a fact that mattered. We'll be thoughtful. They looked at each other for a moment, 2 people from the same general world communicating efficiently across a table. Okay, Ethan said. One more thing. Mercer reached into his jacket and produced a card, plain, minimal, and set it on the table. Your record. Your specific record. The parts of it that exist in the places we both know records like yours exist. Some of my colleagues have been aware of your name for a long time, for reasons that have nothing to do with today. Ethan looked at the card but didn't pick it up. I'm retired. I know you are. I mean that. I understand. Mercer stood. The card's just a card, no pressure attached to it. I'm not here to recruit you. He straightened his jacket. I'm here because a situation resolved itself in an unlikely way, and I wanted to put a face to a name I've been reading for a long time. A brief pause that was the closest he'd come to anything personal. I'm glad you were here, Mr. Cross. He walked away. Ethan left the card on the table. He looked at it for a while, then picked it up and put it in his jacket pocket because leaving government business cards on cafe tables seemed like it could cause its own set of complications. The formal statement took 22 minutes, which was faster than he'd expected, partly because Reyes was efficient, and partly because the footage had already made everything largely self-explanatory in ways that reduced the amount of verbal reconstruction required. He signed what needed to be signed, corrected one detail about the timing of the third subject's positioning, and was told he could go but should expect follow-up contact within 48 hours. He picked up his backpack from where it had landed when he dropped it. Beside table 4, the buckle had popped open and Marcus's extra shin guards had slid halfway out, which he noticed with a particular tiredness, and refastened it. He was standing, putting his jacket back on, when Danny appeared from behind the counter. The kid looked like he'd been through a washing machine, which was fair. His eyes were still a size too large and his hands had a faint tremor that he was managing by pressing them against the counter's edge. But he was upright, which counted for something. Hey, Danny said. I wanted to say something before you left. Ethan waited. I should have, when she asked me to move you, I should have said no right away. I kind of hesitated and He stopped. I don't know why I'm telling you this right now. The timing is insane. It's okay, Ethan said. It's not, really. You were a paying customer and you'd done nothing wrong and I hesitated because he gestured vaguely. She's the kind of person you hesitate with, and that's a bad reason. It's a human reason, Ethan said. You didn't move me. In the end, you didn't. Because of that woman, Frances. Partly. And partly you. He looked at the kid directly. You held the line when it counted. Earlier today and when it really counted. He picked up the backpack strap. You did all right, Danny. The kid's jaw moved in the way that people's jaws move when something is happening behind their face that they're not going to let be visible in public. That Colombian single origin, Danny said, voice slightly rougher than before. Next time you come in, it's on me. Ethan almost smiled. I'll hold you to that. I was near the door when Isabella Sterling said his name. Or not his name. She didn't know his name yet. She said, "Excuse me." The way you say it when you're not sure the person will stop and you're saying it anyway. He stopped. She'd gotten to her feet sometime in the last few minutes. She'd done something to her hair. Not fixed it exactly, but gathered it back in a way that suggested she'd tried and partly succeeded. The coffee stain on his blazer was still there. She was holding the paper cup with both hands. He turned around and waited. She was about 8 feet away. She didn't close the distance. For someone who'd spent the last 40 minutes demonstrating that she didn't struggle for words, she was struggling now. He could see it. The way her mouth started and stopped. The way she looked briefly at a point somewhere over his left shoulder before bringing her eyes back to his face. I don't... She stopped. Started differently. What you did. She looked around the room, briefly, as though the evidence of it would help her say the thing she was trying to say. I don't have the right words for what you did. You don't need them, he said. I do. She said it quickly, with a certainty that was the first completely unguarded thing he'd seen from her. I owe you. You owe me a cup of coffee you didn't pay for, he said. I'll take care of it on the way out. She blinked. I'm not... She exhaled. I'm not talking about that. I know what you're talking about, he said. His voice was the same tone it had been all morning. Not angry, not pointed, not performing anything. And I appreciate it. But you don't owe me anything for what happened an hour ago. That's not what that was. Then what was it? He thought about how to answer honestly without turning it into a speech. Other people in the room. None of them should get hurt because of something that had nothing to do with them. He shifted the backpack. That's all. She was looking at him with an expression he didn't quite know how to read. Something working through layers. Priya had come to stand a few feet behind her, and the suited man who'd helped her up was nearby, and none of them were saying anything. Earlier, Isabella said, before any of this, the way She stopped again. I've got to get to a soccer field, he said, not unkindly. I was horrible to you, she said. Flat, clear, not dressed up. I was horrible to you in front of a room full of people, and I did it because I decided, in about 30 seconds, what category you belong to, and I never questioned it. A beat. And then you saved my life. The room was quietly listening. He was aware of it. She was probably aware of it too, and he noticed that she didn't seem to be saying it for the room. She was saying it directly to him, which was different. What's your name? She asked. Ethan, he said. Ethan Cross. She nodded, like she was storing it somewhere specific. My name is... I know who you are, he said. Not as a thing he'd known before this morning, but as a thing he'd learned from the conversations around him in the aftermath, the way people had said her name, the way Agent Mercer's expression had shifted slightly when he'd looked in her direction. She seemed slightly thrown by that. Then you know that I know what you do, he said. I don't know who you are. He said it without any intention of being cutting. He said it the way he'd have said any simple factual thing. Neither do I, really. We met for about 20 minutes. She held the cup with both hands and looked at him, and whatever was working through her expression had gotten somewhere difficult. I'm sorry, she said. For earlier. I am genuinely sorry. He looked at her for a moment. Okay, he said. That's it? What else would there be? She opened her mouth, closed it. One of the men behind her shifted his weight. Most people would be angrier, she said. Probably, he agreed. You're not. I'm a little bit, he said honestly, but anger's expensive and I've got things to do today. He adjusted the backpack strap on his shoulder. The mismatched buckle had been digging into his hand for the last few minutes. Take care of yourself, Ms. Sterling. He turned and walked to the door. Frances was still sitting beside Danny near the counter, and as Ethan passed, she looked up at him with those steady, decades-weathered eyes. Tuesday next week, she said. Same table. He paused. Probably. Good, she said, and returned to whatever she'd been saying to Danny. He pushed through the glass door and the little bell made its apologetic sound again, and then he was on the sidewalk in the October air, which was cold in a way that felt deliberate, like the city had spent the last hour at temperature and was now resuming normal operations without comment. He walked fast. He had 26 minutes and the recreation center was 6 blocks, but he'd been moving through this neighborhood long enough to know where the lights ran long and where they didn't, and if he took Callaway instead of direct on 5th, he could cut 2 blocks and make the north entrance of the rec center with time to spare. His hands were fine, they were steady, which sometimes surprised people who asked about it. The assumption that you'd shake afterward. You didn't, or he didn't, not right after. The shaking, when it came later. Sometimes 3 in the morning, sometimes in the cereal aisle at the grocery store when a sound hit the wrong angle. It had a schedule of its own that had nothing to do with whether he'd been calm in the situation that prompted it. He'd learned to work around the schedule. It wasn't the same as being okay with it, but working around things was something he understood. He thought about what Mercer had said. The footage, already out. He'd had experiences before, earlier in his career, where things had been documented and distributed, and he'd had no say in it. Different context, different kind of documentation, but the essential helplessness of it was familiar. You couldn't unring a bell. The question was what the bell called in. Marcus was going to find out. That was the thing he kept landing on, turning over. He'd built a quiet life very specifically so that Marcus would have a quiet life. No shadows from Ethan's history falling across his son's ordinary childhood. No explanations required that a 12-year-old shouldn't have to sit with yet. A regular apartment, a regular school. Tuesday morning coffees and Saturday soccer, and a dad who showed up in a worn jacket and didn't bring the other thing with him. That particular version of things was probably over now. He turned onto Callaway and walked through the particular smell of the street. Coffee, from the shop on the corner, exhaust, the bakery, 2 doors down that started its ovens before 5, and tried to think about what he'd say to Marcus. Not now. Not today, maybe. But soon. Your dad used to do something, he'd say, before you were old enough to remember. He'd thought about this conversation in the abstract over the years. Had never figured out the exact version of it that worked. Probably there wasn't an exact version. Probably it was one of those conversations that you started and then you both figured it out together, and it was messy and incomplete and didn't resolve the way either of you needed it to, and that was just the conversation it was. He turned north on the block before the rec center and could already hear it. The distant sound of 12-year-olds, the coach's whistle, the particular pitch of children who are moving fast and are outside and are not yet thinking about any of the things that will eventually require thought. He checked his watch, 4 minutes early. He found a spot along the low fence at the edge of the field and stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, and watched his son. Marcus was on the left side, same as always. The coach had said he hung back. Ethan watched him and saw something different. He saw the kid scanning, reading the field, waiting for the moment that other players hadn't calculated yet. Not hesitating, preparing. That's not a flaw, Ethan thought, watching him. That's a different kind of seeing. Marcus turned at some point and saw him along the fence and raised one hand in a wave that tried very hard to be casual and almost succeeded. Ethan raised his hand back. His son turned back to the practice with the effortful indifference of a 12-year-old who wasn't going to let his dad see that he was glad he'd showed up. Ethan put his hands back in his pockets. The October air moved through the field. Somewhere behind him, the city continued its indifferent motion. A Tuesday doing what Tuesdays did, unbothered and ongoing. He stayed along the fence and watched his son play. Marcus scored a goal at 9:47. It wasn't a clean goal. He'd been out of position for most of the play, drifting too far left, same as the coach had complained about. And then something shifted and he was suddenly exactly where the ball needed him to be, in the gap between 2 defenders who'd both assumed the other one had it covered. He struck it a little too hard and it hit the inside post before going in, which made a sound that was undignified, and Marcus stood there for half a second with his arms slightly out at his sides like he was surprised it had worked. Then the other kids were yelling at him, and he started laughing, and Ethan, standing at the fence with his hands in his jacket pockets, felt something in his chest that he didn't have a precise name for. It wasn't pride, exactly, or not only that. It was something that included the fact that he'd almost not been standing at this fence this morning, and that Marcus didn't know that, and that was exactly how it was supposed to be. He clapped. A few other parents along the fence clapped with him. The coach blew the whistle to reset, and Marcus jogged back to his position, and life resumed its ordinary forward motion. Ethan's phone had been buzzing in his pocket at intervals since he'd left the cafe. He'd been ignoring it. He checked it now, while the team ran a passing drill, and what he found was not what he'd been expecting, which was foolish in retrospect because he'd had enough experience to know that the gap between an event and the digital version of it was closing every year and had now gotten very small. 11 missed calls. 4 from numbers he didn't recognize. 2 from his sister Diane in Raleigh. 3 from a number with a 703 area code that he'd bet his car was a DOD public affairs office. 1 from Marcus's school, which made his stomach tighten before he remembered it was likely routine. 1 from a number he didn't have saved but recognized when he looked at it. A fellow retired SEAL named Brooks, who lived outside of Richmond and who never called unless it was something. 47 text messages. He put the phone back in his pocket. The passing drill continued. Marcus had the ball now and was trying to thread it through a gap that probably wasn't there, which was another habit, the optimism of the angle. And Ethan watched him try and fail and reset without any visible frustration, and thought about Diane and what her voicemail was probably going to sound like, and what he'd say to her. He'd call her back. Not right now. Right now, he was at the fence. Practice ended at 9:15 on the schedule and 9:22 in reality because the coach, a large, affable man named Patterson, who taught middle school science and coached soccer with the particular energy of someone who considered this the more important of the two jobs, had things to say about the second-half positioning that he always had things to say about. And the 12-year-olds endured it with the diplomacy of people who knew that Patterson would eventually run out of things to say if you just let him finish. Marcus came off the field with his shin guards already half off, which was a habit Ethan had given up trying to correct because there was apparently something about the 40-foot walk from the field to the fence that made keeping shin guards on feel unbearable. "You see it?" Marcus said. He was trying not to look like he was asking. He was absolutely asking. "I saw it," Ethan said. "Bounced off the post. Still went in. Coach said my approach angle was wrong." "Your approach angle got the ball into the net." Marcus considered this with the expression of a 12-year-old processing information that confirmed what he'd already believed and trying to decide if it was okay to agree. He said, "I was lucky." "You were in the right place," Ethan said. "Being in the right place isn't luck. That's reading the field." His son absorbed this while pulling the second shin guard completely off and stuffing it into his bag with the energy of a person finally free of something. "You're always taking my side." "I'm not taking your side. I'm telling you what I saw." "Same thing." "Not really," Ethan said. "Come on." They walked towards the parking lot together. Marcus's bag over his shoulder, Ethan's backpack over his. The particular walk of a parent and child that has its own rhythm, worn smooth by repetition. Around them, other families were doing the same, dissolving away from the morning, cars starting, parents calling names. The ordinary dispersal of a thing that had finished. Ethan waited until they were in the car, until Marcus had his seatbelt on and his phone out and was already somewhere else. In the way that 12-year-olds went somewhere else the moment a screen was available, and then he said, "Something happened this morning, before I got here." Marcus looked up from the phone with the alert expression of someone who had learned that this particular sentence construction from his father meant something specific. "Something bad?" "Something that's going to be on the news," Ethan said carefully. "And I want you to hear it from me before you see it somewhere else." His son put the phone face down on his knee. Ethan had thought, walking from the fence to the car, about how to say it. He'd run through several versions and hadn't liked any of them. So he said the plain version, which was usually the right one even when it was the hardest. "There were some men at the coffee shop this morning, armed men. They tried to rob it." He paused. "I stopped them." Marcus was still. In the way that he was sometimes still when he was processing. Not frozen, just gathering. "Stop them how?" Marcus said. It wasn't quite a question. "The way I was trained to." A long silence. Outside the car, A minivan backed out of a spot. A kid pressed his face against the rear window and made a face at nobody in particular, and the ordinary business of the parking lot continued without any awareness of the conversation inside a 10-year-old sedan near the fence. "Were you—" Marcus started, stopped. "Did anyone get hurt?" "No," Ethan said. "Nobody." His son nodded, slowly, the way he nodded when he was accepting a thing rather than agreeing with it. "The men. They're in custody. But you had to—" "Yes." Another silence. Marcus looked out the windshield at something that wasn't there. "Is that what you used to do?" he asked. "Before." This was the conversation Ethan had been half preparing for 3 years and still hadn't found the right opening to. It had arrived now, here, in a parking lot that smelled like cut grass and car exhaust, without asking whether the timing was good. "Some of it," Ethan said, "a version of it. The job was—" He tried to find the honest shape of it. It was about keeping people safe, usually people who were in situations they couldn't get out of by themselves. Like hostages. Sometimes. Marcus turned his head and looked at his father with the eyes that Ethan sometimes thought about when he thought about what Carol had given this child. Not her nose, not her smile, those were there too, but the eyes. The quality of them. The way they looked at things like they were genuinely trying to understand rather than simply evaluate. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because you were 9, Ethan said, and 8 before that, and 7 before that. I'm 12 now." "I know." "Were you ever going to tell me?" Ethan looked at his son. "Yes," he said. "I was working up to it. How long does it take to work up to something? The honesty in it, the clean 12-year-old logic, hit somewhere that didn't have armor." "Apparently about 3 years," Ethan said. Marcus looked back out the windshield. He was quiet for long enough that Ethan started to wonder what was happening in there, in that head that was built out of 2 people and then had become entirely its own thing. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked. Ethan blinked. "What?" "This morning, are you okay?" He looked at his son. 12 years old, shin guards in a bag, dried grass on his cleats, phone face down on his knee, asking the question that it sometimes took adults years to think to ask. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I'm okay." "You sure?" "I'm sure." Marcus nodded, picked up the phone, put it down again. "Can we get breakfast?" "Yeah," Ethan said and started the car. "We can get breakfast." The footage hit 4 million views by noon. Ethan didn't know this until Diane told him, on the phone, from Raleigh, in the tone of someone who was trying to be calm and wasn't quite managing it. Diane was 3 years older than him and had spent those 3 years being protective of him in ways that he'd spent most of his life being grateful for while simultaneously finding mildly exhausting. "Ethan, it's everywhere." "I know." The Today Show called the number I had listed for Mom's estate. I don't even know how they found it. I had 3 reporters at my door this morning. At my door. In Raleigh. "Diane, you can't just say I know like that makes it better. Does Marcus know?" "I told him this morning." "How did he take it?" "He asked if we could get breakfast." A pause. "That's very Marcus." "Yeah." He heard her exhale, the long, careful exhale that meant she was switching from the reactive version of herself to the one that had raised 2 kids and managed their mother's last years, and knew how to prioritize. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing right now. I just wanted to call you back before—" He checked the clock. "Before whatever happens next happens." "What happens next?" "I genuinely don't know," he said honestly. She was quiet for a moment. "The footage, Ethan. You can see everything. The way she talked to you in the beginning, the photo she took, all of it." "I know." "People are angry. People are always angry at something," he said. "This time it's aimed at a specific person who was already famous." Diane said it in a way that acknowledged she knew he understood the implication. "This is going to land on her hard. That's not my problem to manage. I know it isn't. She stopped. "I just want to make sure you're not sitting in your apartment feeling bad for her." He looked across the small dining table at Marcus, who was eating toast and reading something on his phone with the focused attention of a person who had already located the relevant footage and was processing it privately, which Ethan had expected and decided not to address until Marcus decided to bring it up. "I'm not feeling bad for her," Ethan said. I'm not feeling much about her at all right now. Good, Diane said. That's probably healthy. Is it? I don't know, maybe. Are you eating? I'm watching Marcus eat toast. Eat something yourself. I'll eat something. I'm serious, Ethan. I know you are. He got off the phone and ate a piece of toast and ignored the 11 text messages that had arrived while he'd been on the call. By 2 in the afternoon, the situation with Isabella Sterling had developed a speed and direction that Ethan would later think of as the difference between a fire you could manage and a fire that had found its own oxygen source. The footage was everywhere, not just the 2 seconds. The 2 seconds were the headline, the thing that news editors used in the graphic, and that people clipped into 10-second videos with dramatic soundtracks and posted everywhere they posted things. But the fuller version, the 4-minute cut from the cafe's security camera that somehow ended up on 3 different platforms within 6 hours, showed all of it. The morning. The way Isabella had looked at Ethan when she first noticed him. The conversation with Danny, the photograph, the request. Francis's voice carrying across the room. Ethan agreeing quietly, moving toward the back, Danny's face when Francis spoke up. And then the 3 men. And what happened after. The comment sections were not kind to Isabella Sterling. This was not surprising. Comment sections were rarely kind to anyone, and the specific structure of the story, the billionaire who humiliated a man who then saved her life, was the kind of narrative that the internet processed with the precision of a machine designed specifically for moral outrage. By 3 o'clock, her company's social media accounts had been flooded. By 4, 3 of her major business partners had released statements that said nothing specific, but in their careful nothing specificity said quite a lot. By 5, her PR team had issued a statement acknowledging the events of the morning and pledging that Ms. Sterling took the matter seriously. The statement was not well received. Ethan knew this because Marcus, at some point during the afternoon, put his phone down on the kitchen table and said, without prelude, "She's really getting hammered." Ethan was going through the manila folder with the school forms he still hadn't signed. "I know. Did you see the statement?" "No." "It's not good." Marcus spun the phone across the table. "Her PR people wrote it. You can tell." Ethan looked at it. 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged the incident in language that was specific enough to seem honest and vague enough to avoid commitment. The second spoke about Ms. Sterling's values and her commitment to treating all people with dignity, which given the context landed with a specific awkward weight. The third said she was grateful for the bravery of all individuals involved in the situation. "Bravery of all individuals," Marcus read over his shoulder. "That's you." "That's me." "She didn't use your name." "No." "Is that bad?" "For her, probably," Ethan said, and handed the phone back. He returned to the school forms. Field trip permission for a November History Museum visit. Emergency contact update. He needed to add Diane's new cell since she'd changed it in August. The annual technology use agreement that Marcus needed to sign alongside him. Small administrative evidence of a life that was continuing as scheduled. He signed everything and put the folder by the door so he'd remember to put it in the backpack. "Dad," Marcus said. "Yeah." "Were you scared this morning?" The question landed in a space that Ethan took a moment with. He thought about the specific quality of his internal state at 7:52 this morning when the 3 men walked through the door, the sharpening, the slowing down that wasn't slow. The feeling that was not quite fear and not quite its absence, but something that occupied its own category that he'd never found a satisfactory word for. "Not in the way you're probably thinking," he said. "What way am I thinking?" "The kind of scared where your brain stops working." Marcus thought about this. "What kind were you?" "The kind where everything gets very clear," Ethan said, "where you stop thinking about what might happen and you're only in what's happening right now." His son was quiet, considering. "Is that something you can teach?" "Partly," Ethan said. "Partly it's something you practice until it becomes available when you need it." He paused. "Partly it's something I'd rather you never need." Marcus nodded with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who understood that parental preferences and reality had a complicated relationship. "The woman," Marcus said. "The one who said all that stuff to you." "Ms. Sterling." "Yeah." He was looking at the phone again, but not like he was reading anything, more like he was thinking at it. "Did you want to say something back when she was doing it?" Ethan looked at his son. Yes, he said. A little. But you didn't. No. Why? He thought about the answer that was true versus the answer that was instructive, and whether those were the same thing. Because nothing I could have said in that moment would have changed anything, he said. She'd already made up her mind about what she was looking at. Arguing with a conclusion doesn't work. People have to arrive at different conclusions themselves. What if they never do? Then they don't. He shrugged slightly. But that's on them, not on you. Marcus turned the phone over in his hands. She looked pretty scared in the footage. When the gun was by her head, she was. Did you feel bad for her? I felt concerned for everyone in that room. She was in that room. That's a very diplomatic answer. You're 12. When did you learn the word diplomatic? Patterson uses it when he means someone is lying carefully. Ethan looked at his son for a long moment and then, unexpectedly, laughed. It came out rougher than it would have on a different kind of day, but it was real. Fair enough, he said. I felt bad for her. Yes. The same way I'd feel bad for anyone with a gun next to their head. Whatever she said to me earlier in the morning, nobody deserves that. Marcus nodded like this was the answer he'd been waiting for. You're pretty consistent, he said. Is that a compliment? Yeah, his son said. I think so. The call he hadn't been expecting came at 6:47 that evening from Priya Anand, whose number he didn't have and who'd apparently gotten his from the police report through a contact she didn't explain and probably shouldn't have had. He almost didn't pick up. Then he did, because not picking up unfamiliar numbers was a luxury that belonged to a period of his life that had ended approximately 11 hours ago. Mr. Cross. Efficient, direct. The voice of someone who was managing multiple things and had allocated a specific portion of her attention to this call. My name is Priya Anand. I was at Meridian this morning with Ms. Sterling. I remember, he said. I'm going to skip the part where I explain why I'm calling because I think you already know. She wants to reach out, he said. A brief pause. It's been a difficult day for her. I imagine. That's not... Priya stopped, recalibrated. When she spoke again, some of the efficiency had dropped, and what was underneath it was more direct. She's not doing well. Not because of the press. She's had bad press before. She knows how to handle bad press. It's something else. And she asked me to call you because she wanted to know if you'd be willing to speak with her. Not formally. Not for any particular purpose. She just... Another pause. She asked me to say that she doesn't think a text message or an email is adequate for what she needs to say, and she wanted to know if you'd be willing to have a conversation. Ethan was standing in the kitchen. The dinner dishes were done. Marcus was in his room doing homework, or the version of homework that also involved music and possibly a game running in a secondary window, which Ethan had decided some battles weren't worth. Outside the window of the apartment, the city was doing its evening version of itself. Slower and more amber and less indifferent than the morning. Tell her I'm not angry at her, he said. I'll tell her that. But I don't think it's about whether you're angry. What's it about? Priya was quiet for a moment. I've worked with Isabella for 4 years. I've watched her handle situations that would have broken other people without blinking. Today she cried in a bathroom for 20 minutes and then came out and apologized to me for something she said in 2023 that I'd frankly forgotten about. A beat. Something happened to her today, and I think part of it is sitting in a complicated place with where it happened and who it involved. He stood at the window and looked at the amber-lit street. I'm not a therapist, he said. She's not looking for one. I'm not in a position to take... She's not asking you to fix anything, Priya said. She's asking for 5 minutes, maybe 10. She'd come to you. Whatever location works for you. She'd keep it private. No cameras, no documentation, nothing she'd ever use in a public way. He turned this over. He thought about Marcus's question in the car. Why didn't you tell me before? And about the answer he'd given, which was honest but incomplete, because the full answer was that there were things that changed people, and some of those things were hard to explain until the other person had experienced something that at least approximated the relevant geography. He didn't know what Isabella Sterling had experienced today. He knew what she'd walked into. He knew what she'd looked like on the floor. Tomorrow, he said. Morning. There's the coffee shop on Whitmore, 3 blocks from the park on Elliott. It's not the kind of place anyone would recognize her. What time? 8:30. She'll be there, Priya said. Then, after a moment, thank you, Mr. Cross. Don't thank me yet, he said. I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't think she does either, Priya said, and hung up. He stood at the window for a while after that, watching the street. A couple walking a dog that was straining against the leash toward something on the sidewalk. A man on a phone, laughing at something. A delivery truck double parked with its hazards blinking. The driver moving fast, efficient, knowing exactly how long he had before someone objected. The ordinary city in its ordinary evening. He turned away from the window and knocked on Marcus's door. Yeah. He pushed it open. Marcus was at his desk, headphones around his neck now instead of on his ears, which was a compromise they'd arrived at for homework hours without negotiating it explicitly. The homework was math, which Marcus was competent at, but resistant toward in the specific way of a person who understood why it mattered and still found it annoying that it did. How's it going? Fine, Marcus said, with the inflection that meant it was not fine but was manageable. You need help? No. A pause. Maybe. The word problem at the end. Ethan pulled the spare chair from the corner and sat beside him and looked at the problem, which involved a train and 2 cities and a question about time that was dressed up in more words than it needed. He read it once. Okay, he said. So first thing, ignore the part about the train stations. That's decoration. What are we actually being asked? Marcus read it again. How long until they meet? Right. So what do you need to find that? Speed and distance. You have the speeds. You need to figure out the combined rate. He tapped the paper. Try it. He watched his son work through it. Slow at first, the pencil hesitating, and then picking up as the shape of it became clearer. Outside the room, the apartment was quiet. The dinner dishes were done, and the school forms were by the door, and the city was doing what cities did at 8 in the evening, its own particular math of motion and time. Marcus got it wrong the first time by a small margin, found the error himself, corrected it, and looked up. Right? Ethan checked it. Right, he said. His son let out the breath of someone who'd been holding it since the problem started, turned the page, and moved on. Ethan stayed in the spare chair for a while, not because the next problem required him, but because the room was warm and his son was there, and the day had been a specific kind of long that left a person needing to be somewhere small and real and quiet. He stayed until Marcus told him, without looking up from the notebook, Dad, I'm fine. You can go watch TV or whatever. I'm not hovering. You're literally just sitting there. I live here, Ethan said. I'm allowed to sit places. You're hovering, Marcus said, but the corner of his mouth moved. Ethan stood up and put the chair back in the corner. At the door, he paused. Marcus. Yeah. I'm proud of you, for today, for how you handled what I told you. His son was quiet for a moment. I haven't handled anything yet. I just ate toast. That's handling it, Ethan said. More than it sounds like. He pulled the door mostly closed and went back to the kitchen and made himself a cup of the generic coffee that came in the large container from the grocery store, and that tasted about 60% as good as what Danny served, but which cost about 15% as much, and which he drank without complaint because it was coffee, and it was hot, and it was his. He sat at the kitchen table and drank it. The thing that happened at 3 in the morning sometimes, the shaking, the specific unwelcome visitation of whatever his nervous system felt it needed to process in the hours when the rest of him was trying to sleep, was going to arrive tonight probably. Maybe worse than usual. He knew the signs. He'd had a long day of controlled stillness, and the body kept its own ledger and always balanced it eventually. But that was later. Right now there was the coffee and the quiet apartment and his son doing math in the next room and the amber city outside the window, and a meeting tomorrow morning that he didn't know what to do with yet. He finished the coffee, rinsed the cup, turned off the kitchen light. One thing at a time had always been the only way through anything. Tonight the thing was sleep. Tomorrow at 8:30 was tomorrow at 8:30. He went to bed with the city noise filtering through the window the way it always did, that specific low urban frequency that he'd hated when he first moved here from the quieter place they'd lived when Carol was still alive. and that he'd come to rely on somewhere in the last 3 years in the way you relied on things that had become part of the rhythm of where you were. The city didn't care about his story. That was still true. But it was loud in a way that said it was still going, still in motion, still running the numbers of a million separate lives in its indifferent overnight arithmetic. He was one of them. That was enough for tonight. He woke at 2:51, which was close enough to 3 that it didn't feel like a coincidence. That. The kind of waking that happened without drama. Eyes simply opening in the dark. Body already alert in the way that bodies trained to be alert didn't entirely stop being, regardless of what the mind wanted. He lay still for a moment, listening to the apartment. Marcus's door was closed. The city outside was doing its quieter version of itself, reduced to a low hum and the occasional sound of a vehicle moving through the wet street below, because it had rained sometime after midnight, and he hadn't been awake to hear it start. He got up. He didn't fight the waking anymore. He tried that for the first year after he retired, and all it had accomplished was lying in the dark. Feeling bad about lying in the dark, which was a waste of time. He could have spent doing something else. He went to the kitchen and didn't turn on the overhead light, just the small one above the stove, which cast the room in a kind of dim amber that was enough to see by without being the kind of light that committed you to being awake. He put water on for instant coffee, which was a different category of compromise than the generic ground stuff, but which required less of him at 3 in the morning, and while it heated, he stood at the window and looked at the wet street below. The rain had left everything with a surface shine. The streetlights hit the puddles and the parked car roofs and the stretch of sidewalk in front of the dry cleaners across the street. And the whole scene had the quality of something that had been cleaned without being changed, which was its own kind of thing. He thought about Carol. He did this less now than he used to. Less as an active choice, more as a natural fading of the constant frequency of it. It used to be that he couldn't look at Marcus without the overlay, the simultaneous presence of the child, and the absence of the person who should have been there watching him with Ethan. That had softened into something more manageable. Not gone, just less sharp. Tonight he thought about her because of Marcus's question in the car. Is that what you used to do? Before. Carol had known. She'd always known exactly what he did, or as much of it as could be communicated to a person who wasn't in it, the real shape of it, the weight class of the situations he navigated. She'd understood it not with any romantic idea of heroism, but with the specific clear-eyed understanding of a woman who'd made her peace with the reality of what she'd married, not the abstract version of it. She'd been afraid for him in a practical way, not a dramatic one. She'd kept a running list once, on a notepad in the kitchen drawer, of things she needed him to know in case he didn't come back from a particular deployment. Not sentimental things, mostly. Insurance information, where the car title was filed. Which of Marcus's shots were due? Practical love, enacted in the language of a woman who refused to pretend that permanence was guaranteed, but also refused to let that fear run the house. He'd found the notepad after, when he was cleaning out the drawer to put her things away. It had been updated as recently as 2 months before the diagnosis, which meant she'd been maintaining it without telling him, a quiet, ongoing act of preparation that she'd have been embarrassed to explain if he'd discovered it while she was alive. He'd kept the notepad. It was in the shoebox under his bed with the commendations. He hadn't read it again after that first time. He didn't need to. He'd memorized it in the way that certain things lodged in you permanently, whether you intended to carry them or not. She would have had something to say about yesterday. Something specific, and probably funny, and probably also true, in the way that cut to the center of things without being unkind about it. He'd spent 3 years having imaginary conversations with her about events she hadn't been present for, which was strange, and also, he suspected, pretty common, and which he'd never mentioned to anyone because it was the kind of thing that could be misconstrued as unhealthy when it was actually just ongoing. The continuation of a conversation that had gotten interrupted. You picked the table with the sight lines, he imagined her saying, in the voice that knew him better than any other voice had. Of course you did. You can't help it. It was useful, he'd say. It's always useful. That's how you justify it. He drank the instant coffee and watched the wet street and let the imaginary conversation go where it went, which was nowhere in particular, which was fine, which was most of what those conversations were. The comfort of a familiar voice in a quiet kitchen at 3 in the morning. At 4:15, he went back to bed and slept without incident until 6:52 p.m. The coffee shop on Whitmore was called Perch, which Ethan had always thought was an odd name for a place whose primary function was getting people caffeinated before the working day required things of them, but which Marcus had once explained, with the authority of a person who'd Googled it while Ethan wasn't looking, was a reference to the building it occupied, which had been a birdwatching society's meeting house in the 1940s, and still had the original wood-paneled walls and two framed illustrations of regional migratory birds near the back that most of the current clientele probably walked past without noticing. It was smaller than Meridian, lower ceilings, the kind of place that had regular customers who came because it was theirs rather than because it was impressive. The barista here, a woman named Sue, who was roughly Ethan's age and whose general demeanor communicated that she'd made her peace with the early mornings a long time ago, knew his order and had started making it when she saw him come through the door, which was something he'd never asked her to do and had never commented on because drawing attention to it seemed like it might ruin it. He got there at 8:20, which gave him 10 minutes before Isabella was due, which was not an accident. He chose a table near the back, where the light was good and the birdwatching illustrations were visible, and where the angle gave him an adequate view of the entrance without putting him in the direct sightline of anyone coming through the door. Sue brought the coffee without being asked. He thanked her. She went back to the counter without small talk, which was another thing he appreciated about Perch. Isabella arrived at 8:29. She came alone, which surprised him. No Priya, no suited men, no one managing the perimeter of her presence. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweater, her hair loose, and she looked like she hadn't slept particularly well, which was information her usual presentation would never have allowed to be visible. She scanned the room when she came in and found him, and didn't do the hesitating thing that people sometimes did when they arrived somewhere and were nervous. She came directly to the table and sat down across from him. "Thank you for this," she said. "You want coffee?" he asked. She looked at the cup in front of him like she'd momentarily forgotten that was a thing available in the world. "Yes, please." He caught Sue's eye and held up two fingers, and Sue nodded. Simple exchange. He liked that about Perch. They sat in the kind of silence that he'd learned to recognize as different from awkward silence. This one had something working in it, some interior preparation on her end that he didn't want to interrupt. He drank his coffee. Outside on Whitmore, a delivery truck moved past, slower than necessary, and a woman in a yellow coat walked a large dog that was investigating everything on the sidewalk with democratic thoroughness. Sue brought Isabella's coffee. Isabella wrapped her hands around the cup in a way that Ethan recognized. The same thing he did, using the warmth as something to organize around. "I watched the footage last night," Isabella said. "All of it." He waited. "I've watched it." She stopped. "More times than is probably useful. I kept thinking I'd see something different, some angle where what I did was less." She exhaled. "But it's not. It's exactly what it looks like." "What does it look like to you?" he asked. She looked at him with the expression of someone who'd been asked the precise question they'd been trying to avoid. "It looks like I saw a person and decided, in about 30 seconds, that he wasn't worth the same air I was breathing, and then I did everything possible to make that conclusion visible to everyone in the room." She paused. "And photographed it, which is possibly the worst part." "Why the photograph?" "Because I was going to send it to someone." She held the cup. "A friend. Another person in my world. It was going to be—" She seemed to be choosing the honest version. "It was going to be a joke. Look at this. Look at what doesn't belong here. That kind of thing." "Did you send it?" "I deleted it when everything happened." She looked at the table, which is not the same as not having taken it. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She seemed to appreciate that he didn't soften it. "You're not going to tell me it's okay." "I wasn't planning to." "Good." She moved the cup slightly on the table. I think I expected that you'd either be very angry and I'd have to sit with that, or very forgiving in a way that would feel like charity. And I wasn't sure which would be worse." "I'm neither," he said. "What are you?" He considered the question honestly. "Tired," he said, "and I've been trying to figure out what this conversation is actually supposed to accomplish." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you apologized. Yesterday, at the cafe. That was real. I could tell it was real." He held his cup. "So the question is what this morning is for. If it's for you to feel better, I'm not sure I'm the person to provide that. If it's something else, I'd like to understand what. Isabella was quiet for long enough that he wondered if he'd miscalculated the directness. Then she said, "It's not for me to feel better, or I didn't plan it that way." A pause. "I think I needed to sit across from you when there wasn't a police presence in a room full of witnesses and understand what I actually did. Not the footage version, the person version." "What's the difference?" "The footage is..." She moved her hand slightly. "It's a story. It has a shape. I'm the villain. You're the hero. The ending is very clean. Everyone watching it gets to feel righteous for about 30 seconds before they scroll to something else." She said it without bitterness, just with the exhausted accuracy of a person who'd spent her career understanding how narratives moved. "But I was in the room. I didn't see a story. I saw a Tuesday morning that I made choices in, and I made bad choices, and I need to understand why I made them, rather than just feeling terrible about it." He looked at her for a moment. "Why do you think you made them?" "I've been thinking about that all night." She turned the cup again, the habit of it, the motion. "I grew up without money. Not the poverty that I know exists and that I'm not claiming, but the kind of without money where you understood every week that you were one bad month away from something worse. And I decided, very young, that I was going to make sure that never happened to me again. And I did that. I built everything I built, and I worked in a way that probably cost me things I didn't notice it costing me at the time." She looked at her hands around the cup. "And somewhere in the building of it, I started reading people the way I read balance sheets. Assets and liabilities. What you project, what you cost, what you return." "And I looked like a liability," Ethan said. "You looked like evidence of failure," she said, "which is, I know how that sounds, but that's what it was. When I looked at you, I saw the version of life that I'd spent 20 years running away from, and my brain categorized you as belonging to it, and I reacted to the category rather than the person." A pause. "Which is, to be clear, not an excuse. It's an explanation. There's a difference." "There is," he said. "My mother worked 3 jobs," Isabella said, and the sentence came out differently from the others, with a kind of roughness that hadn't been present before. "She wore an apron to 2 of them. She was the most capable person I've ever known, and she spent her whole life being invisible in rooms full of people who could afford to have her bring things to them." She stopped. "And I walked into that cafe and did to you exactly what every person in every room my mother ever worked in did to her." Her jaw moved. "I don't know how I didn't see that. I don't know at what point I crossed from being her daughter to being one of those people, but I did, and I didn't notice." The coffee shop was quiet around them. Sue was doing something behind the counter. A man near the window was reading an actual newspaper, the physical kind, which Ethan saw less and less. The bird-watching illustrations watched the room with their detailed, patient attention. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. "Because you're the person I did it to," she said simply. "I'm not telling you to transfer the weight of it. I'm telling you because..." She seemed to be finding the edge of something. "Because you saw me, yesterday, before everything happened and after. And you're the only person who has the complete picture. And I needed to sit across from someone who had the complete picture and say the thing out loud." He looked at her for a moment. She didn't look away. "My wife," he said, and felt the specific quality of attention that people offered when he said those words in a certain tone. The slight stillness, the intake of something. "She died 4 years ago. Cancer. Marcus was 8. Isabella was very still. "I'm not telling you for sympathy," he said. "I'm telling you because when she was sick, and I was trying to keep everything moving, the job, the kid, the hospital trips, the forms, the insurance calls, there was a version of me that started coming apart at the seams, in ways that weren't visible from the outside. The outside was fine. Inside was a different situation." He held the cup. "And I had a conversation, about 2 months before she died, with a man I'd served with for 15 years, older guy. He'd lost his wife years before, and he said something I've thought about a lot since." "What did he say?" "He said, the version of yourself that you become when things are hardest isn't a temporary state. It becomes a habit. And habits don't break themselves. You have to actively build the person you want to be after, or the person you were during is the person you stay as." Isabella was quiet. "I'm not comparing situations," Ethan said. "I'm saying that understanding why you did something is the first step. But it's only the first one." "What's the second?" I don't know if there's a fixed sequence, he said. For me, it was showing up every day. For Marcus, doing the specific thing required on the specific day, even when I didn't have the resources I thought I needed to do it. Over time, that built something. Built what? He thought about how to say this without it sounding like a thing he'd prepared, because he hadn't. A version of myself I could live with, he said. Not perfect, not finished, just livable. She looked at him with those eyes that were doing the working through thing he'd noticed at the cafe, layer after layer of something processing beneath the surface. I don't know how to be humble, she said. It came out almost like an admission of a physical limitation. I know it sounds honest, he said. It's a skill I don't have. I've been in rooms where it was a liability since I was 23 years old. You show hesitation, you show softness, She stopped. You show someone that you're uncertain about your own worth, and they take it from you. I learned that early, and I learned it well. There's a difference, Ethan said, between being uncertain about your worth and being willing to know what your worth actually is. She looked at him. Humble doesn't mean small, he said. It means accurate. The sentence sat there between them. Outside, a bus went by on Whitmore. The man with the newspaper turned a page with the specific, unhurried authority of someone who'd decided that this was how he was spending his morning, and the morning could not argue with him. Are you this straightforward with everyone? Isabella said. Or is this specifically because you have nothing to lose with me? Little of both, he said. Something moved across her face that was adjacent to a smile, though it didn't quite arrive. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. Yesterday morning, before, when I said what I said and did what I did. She paused. What were you thinking? He thought about the accurate answer. I was thinking about my son's soccer practice, and about whether the left side formation problem Patterson keeps bringing up is actually a problem. She stared at him. That's it? And then I was thinking about the 3 men who walked through the door. Not about me. You'd moved on, he said. You'd done the thing and redirected your attention. There wasn't much point in me keeping it active. She seemed to be searching for the right word. That's either very healthy or slightly unnerving. Probably both, he said. She looked at her coffee, then at him. What happened to the men? The 3 from yesterday? Federal custody. Mercer's office is handling it. They were part of a larger pattern of commercial robberies. They were going to hurt people. Probably. They had the gun at my head, she said. I know that on one level, obviously. I was there. But last night I kept waking up and being back in that moment. The floor, the sound of it, the way everything... She stopped. I've never been in a situation where I wasn't the most powerful person in the room, she said quietly. I've never been in a situation where my money and my contacts and my ability to think faster than the other person meant nothing at all. Now you have, he said. Now I have. She absorbed that. Is that what it's like for you? In those situations? That feeling of complete removal of agency? No, he said. For me, it goes the other direction. Everything gets very specific, narrow. There's no space for anything that isn't immediately relevant. That sounds better. It's trained, he said. You practice it until it's available. It's not a natural state. Could someone like me learn it? He looked at her for a moment. Learn to function under threat? Probably. Most people can with the right training. He held his cup. But I'd say what you're describing, the waking up, the being back in the moment, that's normal. That's your nervous system doing what nervous systems do after something like that. It doesn't need to be fixed. It needs time. How much time? Depends on the person. Depends on what they do with it. He paused. The people who do the worst with it are usually the people who try to process it alone or who try to outrun it by staying busy. She seemed to hear something in that specific observation that he hadn't necessarily intended to direct at her. I'm very good at staying busy, she said. I know. Is that a critique? It's an observation. She looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating what this conversation was. It had probably started in her mind as a specific thing, apology, explanation, some kind of completion, and it had turned into something else in the way that honest conversations tended to when the people in them stopped managing them. Your son, she said. Marcus. Yes. How old? 12. He knows what happened. I told him yesterday morning, before it was on the news. How did he take it? He asked for breakfast, Ethan said. She looked at him. That sounds like a good kid. He's a very good kid. He said it without qualification. He's also a genuinely difficult 12-year-old about 60% of the time, but yes, good kid. The admission of the difficult 60% seemed to land differently than a pure endorsement would have. She almost smiled again. This time it was closer. I don't have children, she said. I've always told myself I'd think about it later, when the company was more stable, when I had more time. How long have you been telling yourself that? About 6 years? What does more stable look like? She was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure I'd know it if I arrived there. Probably not, he said. That's usually how it works. They sat with that for a moment. Sue appeared briefly to refill Ethan's cup without being asked, which was the kind of grace note that Perch specialized in without making a production of it. I want to do something, Isabella said. With this. With whatever this morning has been and whatever yesterday was. She was looking at the table and then she looked up. I have resources that most people don't have. I've spent 10 years deploying them in ways that were very specifically about building a particular version of my life. And I'm looking at this, she moved her hand slightly, and thinking that there are probably better uses. What kind of uses? Organizations that help people in situations like, she paused, like what I'm assuming your situation looked like. From the outside yesterday morning. Single parents. People who are holding everything together with inadequate materials and not asking for acknowledgement for it. Ethan looked at her. That's a good instinct, he said carefully, but be careful that it doesn't become a way to feel better about myself, she said. I know, I've thought about that. And I think the test is whether I'd still do it if nobody ever knew I was doing it. She held the cup. I'm not sure I can answer that question yet. I'm not sure I've ever done something significant that nobody knew about. The honesty of it stopped him for a moment. Most people in her position in this conversation would have arrived at the charitable impulse and let the arrival be the end of the story. She was sitting with the complication of it, which took something. Do something small first, he said. Something where there's no camera and no press release and no way it comes back to you. See how that feels. That's practical advice. I'm a practical person. I'm noticing that, she said. And this time, the almost smile fully arrived, brief and unguarded, and nothing like the ones he'd seen in the photographs her PR people put in the world. He looked at his watch. 8:56. Marcus's school started at 8:30, which meant he'd been dropped 45 minutes ago and was now somewhere in the middle of a Wednesday morning without knowing that his father was sitting across from the woman from the news footage and talking about humility and nervous systems and what it meant to build a version of yourself you could live with. I need to go, Ethan said. Of course. She didn't try to extend it. He appreciated that. He stood and picked up the backpack. Same backpack, same mismatched buckle, the shin guard safely back in Marcus's bag at home. He put on the field jacket. She stood as well, on the other side of the table, and for a moment they were both standing in the coffee shop, and neither of them quite knew what the goodbye was. Ethan, she said, not Ms. String to Mr. Cross, just the first name. Whatever this was, thank you for it. I still don't know what it was, he said. Me neither. A pause. Maybe that's okay. Maybe, he agreed. He nodded at Sue on the way out. Sue nodded back. The door of Perch let him out onto Whitmore and the October morning, which was overcast today, gray in a way that felt settled rather than threatening, the kind of gray that knew what it was and wasn't making apologies for it. He walked toward home with his hands in his jacket pockets and his thoughts in the particular post-conversation state of something that had gone differently from how it was planned and hadn't been worse for it. He thought about what she'd said, the mother in the apron, the invisible woman in rooms full of people who could afford to have her bring things. He thought about how you could carry a person's entire life inside you, the lessons of it, the sacrifices of it, and still end up being the thing that person's life was a protest against, and not notice until something cracked you open in a cafe on a Tuesday morning and left you on a floor with a gun at your head and a question you'd been avoiding looking at directly. He didn't know what Isabella Sterling would do with the morning. He didn't know if the instinct toward something better would hold against the gravity of a life built in a particular direction, against the habits and the rooms and the version of herself that had been useful for so long. Probably she'd stumble. Probably the change, if it happened, would be uneven and slow and punctuated by moments where the old version reasserted itself because that was how people changed, in his experience, not cleanly, not with the neat arc that the footage of yesterday wanted to give things, but incrementally and imperfectly, and with significant backsliding. He thought that was probably fine. Perfect transformation was a story. Imperfect, ongoing, real effort was an actual life. He turned off Whitmore onto the side street that ran toward his building and nodded at the man who ran the dry cleaners across the way, who was unlocking his front gate in the gray morning with the expression of someone who had never once expected the morning to be easy and had made his peace with that contract a long time ago. The man nodded back. Ethan climbed the stairs to the apartment, unlocked the door, and stood in the small entrance hallway for a moment. The school forms were still by the door in their manila folder. He picked them up and put them in the backpack. The buckle needed to be replaced. He'd been meaning to get to that for 2 weeks. He made a note to do it today. Some things you put off until you couldn't anymore, and then you just did them, and it turned out they'd never required as much as you'd spent imagining them to require. That was true of buckles, and it was true of conversations, and it was probably true of a number of other things he hadn't gotten around to yet. He put the kettle on and stood at the window and watched the gray Wednesday morning hold itself together over the city without drama or fanfare, just the steady, unspectacular work of a day that had decided to exist and was going ahead with it, regardless of anyone's opinion on the matter. The buckle got replaced on a Thursday. It was not a dramatic event. Ethan walked 3 blocks to a hardware and outdoor supply store on Fenner Street that he'd passed probably 400 times without going in, found the replacement clip in a small bin near the back wall, paid $1.62 for it, walked home, and spent 8 minutes replacing it at the kitchen table with a pair of pliers and the focused attention of someone who had been meaning to do this for 3 weeks and was mildly annoyed at himself for having let it sit that long. Marcus watched him from across the table while eating an after-school snack that was technically crackers and technically peanut butter, but had evolved, through Marcus's particular engineering, into a construction of significant structural ambition. That took like 8 minutes, Marcus said. Yes. You've been saying you were going to do that for a month. 3 weeks. Almost a month. I was busy, Ethan said. You got held up at gunpoint and stopped 3 criminals and you couldn't find 8 minutes for a buckle. I wasn't held up. I was a bystander who intervened. Dad. What? That's not a meaningful distinction. Ethan set down the pliers and tested the new buckle, which clicked with the clean, solid sound of a thing that worked properly, and put the backpack on the table. How was school? Patterson gave a quiz on cell division that half the class failed. Did you fail it? No, Marcus said, with the specific neutrality of someone who'd done fine and didn't want to make a production of it. But it was harder than it needed to be. Science is usually harder than it needs to be, Ethan said. That's sort of the point. The point of science is to be harder than it needs to be. The point of science is to be exactly as hard as it is. People just don't like that it doesn't negotiate. Marcus considered this while constructing his next cracker. Did you see the thing about the woman? Sterling? She was on the news again. Ethan had seen it. He'd watched 3 minutes of it while making lunch, standing at the kitchen counter, before turning the television off and finishing his sandwich. Isabella had given a brief statement outside her office building. Not a press conference, not a formal event, just a few minutes on the steps with reporters who'd been there anyway, in which she acknowledged the events of the previous Tuesday without the PR language of the earlier statement. She'd said, among other things, that she had behaved badly toward someone who did not deserve it, and that she was going to spend some time examining what that said about who she'd become, and that she'd rather not speak further about it until she had something worth saying. She hadn't mentioned Ethan by name. She hadn't framed herself as having learned a lesson neatly. She'd looked tired and she'd sounded like herself rather than a version of herself that had been edited for public consumption. He'd found it, unexpectedly, more compelling than a polished apology would have been. I saw it, he said. Do you think she means it? He thought about the coffee shop on Whitmore, the way she'd held the cup, the things she'd said about her mother in the apron. I think she's trying to, he said. Whether it holds is a different question. What makes it hold? Doing the hard version when it's inconvenient, Ethan said. When there's no camera and no one to see it, and it costs you something real. He moved the backpack off the table so Marcus had space. Anyone can change with an audience. The test is what you do when the audience leaves. Marcus ate a cracker. That applies to a lot of things. Pretty much everything. Does it apply to soccer? How would it apply to soccer? Like, practicing the thing you're bad at when nobody's watching versus only doing the impressive stuff when Patterson is looking. Ethan looked at his son. Yes, he said. That's exactly what it means. Marcus nodded like he'd confirmed something he'd already suspected, finished the cracker architecture, and went to do his homework. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the pliers and the old broken buckle, and thought about how his son had a way of finding the center of things through a side door, arriving at the essential point from an unexpected angle, which was something he'd apparently been doing since he was about 4 and showed no signs of stopping. He put the pliers away, threw out the old buckle, made a note to get to the school forms before Friday. The school forms had now been in the backpack for 4 days. 3 weeks passed. The world, which had been briefly fascinated with Ethan Cross in the way that the world became fascinated with things that fit a clean narrative, gradually moved on. This was fine with him. He'd answered the follow-up questions that Reyes required, completed the formal statements, spoken briefly with a DoD public affairs person who'd called from the 703 number and with whom he'd reached an understanding that suited both of them. He'd declined 4 media interview requests through the simple method of not returning the calls, and declined a 5th that had come to Diane, who had relayed it to him and then told the reporter that her brother wasn't available, which was the most accurate thing anyone had said on the subject. Brooks, the retired SEAL from outside Richmond, had called back. That conversation had lasted an hour and 20 minutes and covered, in rough order, what actually happened at Meridian, how Marcus was doing, whether Ethan was sleeping, the specific bureaucratic absurdity of a pension recalculation that Brooks was dealing with, the quality of a fishing spot Brooks had found near the state line, and a discussion of a book they'd both been meaning to read and neither had started. At no point did Brooks say anything, like "I knew you still had it," or "once a SEAL, always a SEAL," or any of the other things that people said, which were meant well and landed wrong. He just talked to Ethan the way he'd always talked to him, like a person he'd known for 22 years, which was the most useful thing anyone offered in the entire 3 weeks. Patterson, the soccer coach, approached Ethan at the fence one Tuesday morning, about 10 days after Meridian, with the expression of a man who had information he wasn't sure how to hold. "Heard about what happened," Patterson said. "At that coffee shop." "Yeah," Ethan said. "You doing okay?" "Fine, yeah, thanks." Patterson nodded, looking at the field. Marcus was running a drill with 2 other kids, the ball moving between them with improving fluency. "I want to apologize for something," Patterson said. Ethan looked at him. "I told you, a few weeks back, that Marcus had a problem with hanging back on the left, that it was a weakness." Patterson kept his eyes on the field. "I've been watching him more carefully since then, and I think I was wrong. He's reading the space. He's not hanging back. He's waiting for the right moment." A pause. "That's a different thing, a better thing, actually. I should have looked harder before I called it a flaw." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "I don't always slow down enough to look," Patterson said, with the directness of a man who'd been thinking about something and had decided to just say it. "I've been coaching 12-year-olds for 9 years, and I've got patterns I reach for. Sometimes the patterns are wrong." He nodded at Ethan, the kind of nod that closed something without making it into more than it was, and walked back toward the players. Ethan watched his son move across the field with the specific quality of attention he always brought to watching Marcus, the reading the space kind, the waiting for the right moment kind, and thought about all the ways that a person could be looked at and still not seen, and all the ways that mattered more than people noticed until it was suddenly very obvious. The call from Priya came in the 4th week, on a Wednesday afternoon while Ethan was at the grocery store, standing in the cereal aisle with a basket that contained pasta, 2 cans of tomatoes, the large container of generic ground coffee, a box of the crackers Marcus had developed an architectural relationship with, and a debate he was having with himself about whether the good bread was worth it this week. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then he answered. "Mr. Cross." "Priya Anand. I'm sorry to bother you." "It's fine. What's going on?" "Isabella asked me to call you. She's done something and she wanted you to know about it, but she didn't want to call directly because she wasn't sure it was appropriate. A brief pause. She asked me to tell you that she's started funding an organization. It supports single-parent families who are in the income gap. Too much to qualify for certain assistance programs, not enough to actually be stable. Emergency funds, childcare subsidies, that kind of thing. She's been running it quietly for 3 weeks. Quietly how? No press, no announcement, no naming rights on anything. She worked with an existing nonprofit to channel the funding, so her name isn't on the outward-facing materials. Priya paused. I want to be transparent, she told me, and I'm telling you, so it's not entirely invisible. But the people receiving the help don't know it comes from her, and she's asked that it stay that way. Ethan stood in the cereal aisle. A woman with a toddler in the cart moved past him, the toddler holding a box of something with a cartoon on it, with the grip of someone who had decided this was theirs now. Why is she telling me? He asked. She said, Priya seemed to be quoting carefully, she said you told her the test was what she did when the audience left. And she wanted someone to know that she was trying, not for credit, just because trying in complete silence felt, a pause, felt like it might make her stop, and she didn't want to stop. He absorbed that. He thought about what he'd said at Perch. Do something small first. Something where there's no camera and no press release. He'd meant it as a practical first step, not a permanent condition. She'd taken it seriously in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. Tell her I said good, he said. Tell her to keep going. That's all? That's all. A pause. She's also... Priya seemed to be deciding whether to continue. She's been seeing a therapist since the week after. I probably shouldn't tell you that either, but she'd want you to know. She doesn't have to account to me for what she does, Ethan said. I know, but she seems to feel differently. Priya's voice had something in it that wasn't quite warmth, but was adjacent to it. The tone of someone who was watching someone else do something difficult and was quietly glad about it. She talks about this conversation at the coffee shop on Whitmore. I don't know what was said, but it seems to have mattered. It went both ways, Ethan said. He got off the call and stood in the cereal aisle for another minute. Got the good bread. It was worth it this week. He couldn't explain exactly why he felt that, but he did, and he'd learned a long time ago to extend small courtesies to himself without requiring a rationale. November arrived with the abrupt change of temperature that this city always used to announce itself, the kind of cold that made everyone slightly indignant for about a week before they accepted it and got their coats. Marcus went through a growth spurt that resulted in him being 2 inches taller than he'd been in September and requiring new cleats, which led to a Saturday afternoon at the sporting goods store that Ethan had budgeted carefully for, and which also involved 35 minutes of Marcus being unable to decide between 2 pairs that were nearly identical and cost exactly the same amount, which was a different kind of patience requirement than 3 armed men, but one that Ethan found in some ways equally demanding. They got the cleats. Marcus decided in the parking lot, 10 seconds after leaving the store, that he'd picked the right ones, with the authority of someone who had needed the decision to be made in order to know they'd made the right one, which Ethan recognized as a trait that had come directly from him, and which he couldn't entirely complain about. The following Tuesday, he went to Meridian. He hadn't been back since the morning it happened, which hadn't been an active avoidance, more a natural gravitational drift toward Perch on Whitmore, which was closer and quieter and where Sue made the coffee the way he liked it without his having to specify. But there were things he'd left unfinished at Meridian, or not unfinished exactly, more. Things that had started there that deserved to be revisited in a normal context. To walk back through the door when it was just a door again. To sit at a table when it was just a table. That kind of completion. He pushed through the glass door at 7:48. The little bell above the entrance. The same exposed brick walls, the Edison bulbs, the wooden tables. The morning crowd doing its morning things, pitched meetings, solitary laptop work. The conferencing groups with their identical lanyards. Danny was behind the counter. He saw Ethan the moment he came through the door, and the specific quality of recognition that moved across his face was different from the professional recognition of a regular customer. It was the kind of recognition that only happened between people who had been in something together. "Hey," Danny said. "Hey. You want the dark roast?" "Yeah." "No room?" "No room." Danny made it and didn't charge him and slid it across the counter, and when Ethan reached for his wallet, Danny shook his head once. Already told you, Colombian's on me when you come in, but I'll settle for you taking the regular. You don't have to. I know I don't. Danny looked at him with those same tired eyes and that same good posture. I know I don't. That's the point. Ethan took the coffee and nodded and went to his table. Second from the window, far wall, the angle that gave him the sight lines to both entrances. He sat down and wrapped his hands around the paper cup and looked at the room. It was just a room. Coffee and conversation and the ordinary human project of getting through the morning. The tables were tables. The door was a door. The corner where the three men had been was a corner where a woman was now sitting alone, reading something on her phone with the expression of someone who was enjoying it, leaning slightly forward in the chair, the way people lean when something has their actual attention. He drank the coffee and let the room be what it currently was, rather than what it had been for a specific 4 minutes 5 weeks ago. This was something he'd practiced for a long time. The discipline of returning places to their present tense, of not letting a single event permanently colonize a location in his memory. It worked better with some places than others. It was working well enough here. Frances came in at 8 o'clock. He saw her before she saw him. The same composed, deliberate walk, the same quality of a woman who had decided exactly how fast she was going to move through the world and wasn't adjusting for anyone. She was alone this morning, without Miriam. She scanned the room and found him and changed course without hesitation. She sat down across from him without asking. He had the feeling she was the kind of person who hadn't asked before sitting down somewhere since approximately 1987. Tuesday, she said. Tuesday, he agreed. She settled herself and put her bag on the chair beside her. She had the same air of someone who was here on her own terms, and the morning could take it or leave it. You look better than you did, she said. Better than I did when? 5 weeks ago, when she was talking at you. Frances had an efficient relationship with euphemism, which was to say she didn't have one. You had the face of a man who was working very hard at something that was costing him. It wasn't costing me that much. It was costing you something. She said it with the finality of someone who had been watching people's faces for 70-plus years and wasn't interested in being contradicted about what she'd observed. How's the boy? He's good. New cleats. Important at 12. Very. Danny appeared with Frances's coffee, which she apparently also ordered without specifying, which meant she was a regular here in her own right, which for some reason pleased Ethan in a way he couldn't entirely articulate. The woman, Frances said when Danny had gone. Sterling. What about her? I've been following what she's doing. Frances held her cup with one hand in the manner of someone who had never needed two hands to anchor themselves. The funding, the organization. He looked at her. How do you know about that? I'm 73 and I have time, and I'm good at finding things out, she said. She's being quiet about it. I had to dig. She wants it quiet. I know she does. That's why I find it credible. Frances looked at him with the level eyes of someone delivering a considered assessment. People who want the credit announce things. People who want the change go quiet. He thought about what Priya had said. Trying in complete silence felt like it might make her stop. And what he'd said back. Tell her to keep going. You knew what she was, Frances said. It wasn't a question. When it was happening, the thing she was doing, you knew it and you sat with it. I didn't have full information. You had enough. She sipped her coffee. Most people, most men in particular in my experience, would have said something, would have made sure she knew they weren't going to just absorb it. It wasn't worth the scene. Or, Frances said, with the precision of a woman who chose her words carefully and landed them where she meant to, you understood that the response that costs you the most dignity in the moment is sometimes the one that changes something rather than just winning the argument. He looked at her. You've thought about this a lot. I've thought about it for 50 years, she said plainly. I'm a black woman who spent a career in corporate law in this city. I have a graduate thesis's worth of material on the subject of what to do when someone treats you as a category rather than a person. She said it without particular heat, as a statement of biography. The ones who argued back in the moment, she moved her hand slightly, they got the satisfaction of the moment. The ones who stayed steady and kept doing the work and let their record speak, another small gesture. They're the ones I remember. Did it feel like enough? In the moment? Absolutely not, she said. It felt terrible in the moment. That's what I'm telling you. The right thing and the satisfying thing are almost never the same thing. He looked at her for a moment. You're a pretty interesting person to run into at 8 o'clock in the morning. I've been told that, Frances said, usually by people who mean it as a complaint. I don't. I know you don't. She settled back slightly. Miriam and I come every Tuesday. We've been coming to this cafe for 11 years, since before it was called Meridian. It was a different name before, something French that nobody could pronounce. And it had worse coffee, but the light was the same. She looked at the windows. 11 years of Tuesdays. Occasionally something interesting happens. Usually it's just coffee. Usually that's enough, he said. Usually it is, she agreed. They sat in a comfortable silence that had earned itself, the kind that happened between people who'd been through something together and didn't need to keep talking about it. Danny moved behind the counter. The morning proceeded with its ordinary, irreversible motion. He thought about Carol on the walk home. Not with the middle-of-the-night weight of it, but with the daytime version, which was lighter, which carried more of the specific textures of who she'd been, rather than the simple fact of her absence. He thought about something she'd said to him once, during a deployment debrief that had gone badly, in a way he couldn't discuss with her specifically, but whose residue she'd recognized in him the way she recognized everything, quietly, without announcement, with the accuracy of long attention. You keep waiting, she'd said, for the thing you do to be worth something more than what it costs. But it doesn't work that way. The worth is in the doing. The cost is just the cost. He hadn't fully understood it then. He was still working on understanding it, which was probably fine. Some things you spend a lifetime understanding incrementally, and the incrementalness was the point rather than an obstacle to it. He climbed the stairs to the apartment. The school forms had finally been submitted 2 weeks ago. The manila folder was empty on the desk, and he'd kept it because it was a good folder and he'd need it for something else eventually. He made lunch, a sandwich with the good bread, which he'd been buying consistently for 3 weeks now, having decided that some small regular elevations in the daily routine were worth the marginal budget adjustment. He ate it standing at the counter, looking out the window at the street, doing the idle observational cataloging that was as involuntary as breathing at this point. The woman with the yellow coat who walked the large dog every Wednesday at this time. The delivery rhythm of the truck that came to the restaurant supply store down the block. The specific lean of the old man who sat outside the barbershop 2 doors down and had never, in Ethan's observation, gotten a haircut there, just sat and watched the street with the proprietary attention of someone who'd decided this corner belonged to him. He thought about what it meant to show up for something, the specific, unglamorous, repetitive reality of it. Marcus at the fence on Tuesday mornings, the school forms, the grocery store, the new buckle that had needed replacing for 3 weeks, the lunch made from good bread because some small dignities were worth keeping even when the larger architecture of life was uncertain. He thought about how there was no audience for most of it, how Marcus would not, at 12, have any understanding of what it cost some mornings to get up and make the lunches and sign the forms and stand at the fence and watch the practice. How the cost was invisible by design because a child shouldn't have to carry the cost of being cared for. The care should just be there, reliable, present, not requiring their acknowledgement to be worth doing. He thought about his father, who had been largely absent, and how that absence had taught him something about presence that no amount of instruction could have, the specific lesson of understanding what it meant to a child to look toward the fence and find it empty. How he'd made a decision, the day Carol died, sitting in a hospital corridor with his hands between his knees and a specific hollow sound in his chest that he hadn't had a word for, that the fence would not be empty. Not because he was certain he could do it right, because he was going to do it regardless. 3 years of Tuesdays, of getting Marcus to school with the shin guards in the bag and the water bottle filled and the homework done, or mostly done. Of making dinner that was not always good but was consistently present. Of staying in the spare chair while the math homework happened. Of the 3 a.m. wakings that came less frequently now, still came, but less. And of getting up and making the instant coffee and standing at the window and letting the city's indifferent noise do the work it did by simply continuing. He'd never thought of any of it as heroic. It had never felt like something worth documenting. It was just the thing required on the day, done because it needed doing, and he was the person available to do it. He was beginning to think, standing at the window with the good bread sandwich, watching the old man hold court outside the barber shop, that this was maybe the point. Not that it wasn't heroic, but that heroism built from the daily invisible requirement was a different animal entirely from the 2-second version that ended up on the news. That the 2 seconds at Meridian, the thing the footage showed, the thing 4 million people had watched, and that a federal agent had driven in from wherever federal agents drove in from to put a face to, that had come from somewhere, had been built from something, had required as its foundation years of the unremarkable stuff. The Tuesday mornings, the shin guards, the good bread purchased on a budget that required some thought before purchasing it. The old man outside the barber shop raised one hand in greeting to someone Ethan couldn't see from the window, a gesture that assumed the greeting would be returned, the confidence of a man who'd been showing up to the same corner for long enough to know it would be. Ethan finished the sandwich, put the plate in the sink. Marcus scored 2 goals in the last game of the November season. The second one was the better one, a left-side approach, the angle that Patterson had spent the fall calling a liability, cutting through a gap that everyone on the opposite team had apparently agreed wasn't being covered, the ball arriving in the net with a clean sound that was entirely different from the post bounce of the October goal. No luck in the geometry of it, just the accumulated practice of a kid who'd spent Tuesday mornings doing the thing correctly in the space between the fence and the field while his father watched from the right side of the barrier. Patterson clapped. Several parents along the fence clapped. The other kids on the team reacted with the loud, brief, completely sincere enthusiasm of people for whom a goal was still a straightforwardly good thing. Ethan stood at the fence with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched his son receive the enthusiasm and handle it with the particular grace of a kid who was glad but not surprised, which was its own kind of thing. Not arrogance. Something more useful than arrogance. The quiet internal accounting of a person who'd done the work and understood that the work was why the result was available. After the game, walking back to the car, Marcus said, "Patterson said I had a good read on the space." He was right. He also said I still need to work on my first touch. Also right. Can't win everything. No, Ethan said. But you can keep working on the things that need work. Marcus considered this with the expression of someone doing the mental accounting of whether this applied to the specific situation or was going to be expanded into a life lesson. He seemed to decide it was both and that this was acceptable. Are we doing the same place for breakfast? If you want. The place with the good hash browns. That's the place. They got in the car. Marcus put his seatbelt on and picked up his phone and then, unusually, put it back down and looked out the windshield at the field where the November morning was doing the last of its work on the remaining players and the coaches and the few parents still talking by the equipment shed. "Dad," he said. "Yeah. I looked some stuff up about your job before." A pause. Not the classified parts, just what was out there. Ethan was quiet, waiting. "I didn't say anything because I wanted to think about it first," Marcus said, "and I've been thinking about it for a couple weeks." "What did you think?" His son turned and looked at him directly. 12 years old, with the eyes that had come from Carol and the deliberateness that Ethan recognized as entirely Marcus's own. "I think you've been a lot of things that I didn't know about," he said. "And I think some of it was probably really hard. And I think you didn't talk about it because you didn't want it to be my thing to carry." Ethan's throat did the thing it sometimes did. He waited. "I want you to know," Marcus said, with the careful precision of someone who had been working out the sentence for 2 weeks, "that I can carry some things. I'm not 8 anymore. You don't have to keep all of it on your side." The parking lot was almost empty. The November light was the thin, pale kind that illuminated without warming. A single soccer ball had been left near the equipment shed and was sitting perfectly still in the dead grass, waiting with the uncomplicated patience of objects for someone to remember it. "Okay," Ethan said. "Okay, you heard me, or okay, you agree?" "Both," Ethan said. "I heard you and I agree." Marcus nodded, picked up the phone. "Good. Can we go? I'm starving. You're always starving. I'm 12. It's biological." Ethan started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, and if his vision was slightly imprecise for the first 30 seconds of the drive, that was information he chose not to share with the 12-year-old who was already deep in his phone and who had said the thing he needed to say and then moved on in the efficient manner of a person who understood that the saying was the point, not the dwelling. The last Tuesday of November, Ethan was at Meridian at 7:42. The same table, the same dark roast from Danny, who had started the cup when he saw the field jacket through the glass door. The same worn backpack with the new buckle that clicked cleanly and didn't snag. The morning crowd doing its morning things with the reliable indifference of mornings. He drank the coffee slowly and watched the room with the attention that had never fully become a choice. That was simply the way his eyes moved through a space and found nothing that required it to be anything other than ordinary attention. Frances came in at 8. She sat across from him without asking. They talked about nothing specific and several particular things, and finished their coffee with the ease of people who were becoming, without having discussed it, a Tuesday fixture, which was its own quiet statement about the things that persisted when you kept showing up for them. When they were leaving, Danny caught Ethan near the door. "The Colombian single origin is back," he said. "New batch. It's really good." Ethan looked at him. "I'll try it next week." "It's on me." "Danny, just let me do the thing," Danny said, with the exasperation of a 22-year-old who had decided something and didn't need it to be complicated. "It's 1 cup of coffee. Let me do the thing." Ethan held up one hand in a gesture of concession, which made Danny look marginally satisfied, and went out through the glass door into the November morning. The bell above the door made its small sound. He walked the 6 blocks to the recreation center. The air was cold in the specific way of late November, the kind that asks something of you in exchange for being outside in it, but delivered on its end of the arrangement by being completely clear. Sky, the particular blue that only arrived when the temperature dropped below a certain point. Every edge of every building sharp against it. The city visible to itself in a way it usually wasn't. He got to the fence 4 minutes before practice started, which was exactly when he meant to get there. Marcus was already on the field, moving through warm-up with the focused looseness of a kid who'd been doing this long enough that the routine was in his body rather than his head. He had the new cleats and the shin guards on correctly, both of them, which Ethan noted without mentioning because some victories were for internal acknowledgement only. His son looked up at some point and saw him at the fence and raised one hand. Ethan raised his back. Marcus turned to the field and went back to work. Ethan stood at the fence with his hands in the pockets of the worn field jacket and watched his son and thought about Carol's notepad and the shoebox under the bed and the specific sound a soccer ball made hitting the inside post of a net and the feeling of a new buckle clicking cleanly and the taste of good bread and the way the old man held court outside the barber shop with the confidence of a person who'd been showing up long enough to know the corner would be there. He thought about what Frances had said. The right thing and the satisfying thing are almost never the same thing. And what was true inside that, the part she hadn't said but that he'd been thinking about since, that you did the right thing anyway. Not because it felt like enough, not because it was recognized, not because anyone was keeping score on your behalf, but because the alternative was becoming someone who'd stopped. And once you stopped, it was a different kind of work to start again, and some people never found the way back. He thought about what Marcus had said in the parking lot. "I can carry some things. You don't have to keep all of it on your side," and how that sentence had redrawn something in him that he hadn't known needed redrawing, the specific geometry of what it meant to protect someone, how protection and isolation were not the same thing, how a child who was given only the cleaned and managed version of a life was also being denied the education of it. He thought about a Tuesday morning 5 weeks ago, when he'd walked into a coffee shop in a worn jacket and been seen as a category rather than a person, and how that had mattered less to him in the moment than he supposed it was supposed to matter, and how he'd later wondered whether the not mattering was healthy distance or accumulated numbness, and how he still wasn't entirely sure, and how being unsure about that seemed honest in a way that being sure would not have been. He thought about Meridian, and the table and the cold coffee he'd finished anyway, because he'd started it. About Danny's face when it was over. About Frances beside the young barista on the floor, saying something quiet and necessary. About Agent Mercer and his careful understatement. About the Whitmore coffee shop and Isabella holding the cup with both hands and saying, "I don't know how to be humble," with the honesty of someone who had finally gotten tired of pretending the gap between who she was and who she meant to be didn't exist. The coach blew the opening whistle. Marcus moved into position on the left side, the space reading position, the waiting for the right moment position, and the practice began its ordinary forward motion. Ethan stood at the fence, The clear November sky held itself above the city with the uncomplicated commitment of things that simply were what they were. The practice ran. Children called to each other across the field with the particular frequency of people for whom the moment was the complete universe. The cold air asked its small price and delivered its clarity in return. He had nowhere else to be. He was exactly where the morning required him. Some people spent their whole lives looking for the version of themselves that was worth something. Ethan Cross had figured out, slowly and imperfectly and not without cost, that the looking was the wrong project, that the worth was in the being present for the specific day, the specific fence, the specific child on the field who looked up to find him there and looked back to the game with the quiet confidence of someone who had expected exactly that. That was the whole thing. It didn't resolve into something more than that. It didn't need to. The practice continued. He stayed at the fence. He would still be there when it was done,